Good morning, everyone. I have a lot of pet portraits to paint this month for the holidays, so today's lesson is going to be about how to paint this particular dog. These are the materials I will be using today. You're welcome to pause this video so you can gather your items. I have my watercolor block, my brushes, a pencil pen, kneaded eraser, a rubber cement pickup, some masking fluid, masking tape, my paints, palette, sponge, paper towels, and of course my water cups. But there is a list of these supplies in the video description if you need to reference them quickly. I plan on using these 5 colors today. You're welcome to pause the video while you gather similar colors. The first one is Payne's Gray, Ultramarine Blue, Alizarin Crimson, a cadmium red deep hue, and burnt sienna. You don't need these exact colors, just get somewhere close. Also in the video description is a line drawing that you can download and print at home. I have printed mine at a 4x4 scale, and I've taped it in position directly on top of my watercolor block. In order to do this transfer, you can do it in one or two ways. The first option is to take the back of your line drawing and apply graphite all over the back to cover the entire image. Then position it directly on top of your watercolor paper and tape it in position so it does not shift. Then with the use of a pen, simply trace your line drawing, and because of the pressure of your pen, it should press that graphite directly into your watercolor paper, resulting in a line drawing. The other option, which is a little faster, is if you have drafting paper or graphite sheets, you can actually just position one of those directly underneath your line drawing once it's taped in position. Make sure the graphite side is facing down to your watercolor paper, and then trace your line drawing using your pen. Once everything is traced, you should be able to see your lines on your watercolor paper. If you press too hard with your drafting or graphite paper, unfortunately your lines will turn out real black and they will be very difficult to get rid of or to hide. So I recommend watching your pressure and peeking after you trace just a short distance. Once you have the line drawing transferred, then we need to keep in mind where all of the light values are in our subject and lighten up any of the lines in that area. We also want to be aware of any smudges that may have occurred from resting our hands or arm on the paper. So I'm just going through the area of the ear where I see lighter values inside the ear to lighten those up. I'm also going to lighten up some of the lines within the inside of the eye. On the sides of the snout. And in the chin area, we have a lot of white fur. And although that white fur has color and value, I don't want dark pencil lines showing up in the area of my white fur. So I'm making a point to kind of go in the areas where I have my whites just to lighten things up so I have less chance of that showing in my finished painting. Everything else is very much in the areas where we have a lot of dark colors like blacks and browns. So I'm not worried about the rest of the pencil lines. Now I'm going to go ahead and begin mixing the colors I plan on using in today's portrait. Matching the colors I see in pet portraits can be occasionally challenging. So I take a hole punch and I punch holes in a scrap piece of watercolor paper. I then take my reference photo and position my paper on top of areas of my dog to help me better interpret and match my paint colors. So for in the area of the chin, although my brain knows it's white fur, because of the shadows, it's actually more of a pink gray. So I'm going to grab a little bit of the alizarin crimson, and I'm going to add some of my Payne's gray. And I want to keep it watered down so it's not too dark. Currently that's too dark, so I need to add more water to my mixture. I'm going to add a little bit more of that alizarin crimson as well. Make sure it's watered down. And next to that hole, without touching it, I'm just going to test out my color. I think I need to add just a little bit of the burnt sienna to give it a warmer tone. And I feel like that's pretty accurate. Now I'm going to move on to some other areas where I see shadows in the whites. And I notice that there is a very faint soft blue. So I'm going to rinse my brush, put some new clean water on my palette, and I'm going to grab the smallest amount of the ultramarine blue. I feel like that's pretty accurate. Now I'm going to try and match some of those brown tones that I see on the side of the dog's cheeks. So I'm going to put water on a new area of my palette, and I'm going to grab a little bit of that burnt sienna. And burnt sienna by itself will be pretty orange. However, if I do add some of that ultramarine blue, since they are complementary to one another, it will help add a little bit more of a neutral tint, giving it a little bit more of a brown color. And you can tell just in comparison, that is still very orange compared to what I want. So I'm going to continue to add ultramarine blue to my mixture. Once I feel like I'm close, I'm going to test out again. And this time I've gone a little too far in the opposite direction. So you can see how these holes in a scrap piece of paper can help us adjust and just make sure that our colors are accurate before we dive into our painting. I feel like that's pretty close. I'm going to add just the tiniest bit of alizarin crimson to warm it up. And I feel like that's our color there. I'm now going to go into the area of the ears, and although my brain tells me that there are pinks, when we position our scrap piece of watercolor paper over that area of our reference photo, it's actually quite dark. So I'm going to put some water in a new area of my palette. I'm going to get the alizarin crimson. I'm going to get a little bit of burnt sienna. And now I'm going to grab just the smallest amount of Payne's gray. And I'm going to test out that color. I want it to be a little bit more pink than that. So I'm going to grab a little bit more alizarin crimson to mix it in. And I'm okay with that color. And then lastly, I'm going to mix up some of that black. I don't often use straight black, so in this particular painting, I'm just going to be using Payne's gray, but a lot of the pigment, so it's nice and dark. And depending on the brand of paint you are using, your Payne's gray might be more blue than mine. So you may have to switch to straight black if you'd like. The other alternative is to make it appear a little bit more black, is add some of that burnt sienna to the paint mixture, and it'll actually turn more of a black. rather than such a dark blue-gray. Now that I'm happy with my paint colors, I'm going to go ahead and begin painting my dog. So the first thing I want to do is I want to apply masking fluid to the eyes of my dog for protection. I recommend soaking your paintbrush in soapy dish soap before you begin to add a layer of protection to your brush. Then dip just the very tip of your brush into your masking fluid and go to the area of the eyes and apply a thin layer to protect. I'm also going to be applying a small amount of this masking fluid in the area of where I see some browns up on the brow. I'm also going to be protecting some of those brown tones that I see in the side cheek of my dog. And the reason I'm doing that is because with this first layer of color, I plan on getting some shadow color to my white fur, and I don't want any of those soft blues or pinks to end up in these areas. So just for the sake of making sure the color is nice and pure, I'm applying just a little bit of masking fluid in the areas where these browns are. While that masking fluid is drying, just to make good use of my time, I am going to mix up a very vibrant red to use for a background color. I'm going to put water in a new area on my palette. I don't want a whole lot of water because I want this color to be very rich and vibrant. And I'm going to grab some of that cadmium red. Now I want to make sure I grab enough of the pigment so that my color comes out like a Coca-Cola red versus a soft muted pink. So anytime I feel like I'm close to mixing the right color, I drag my brush across the rim of my paint palette and I test out my color on a scrap piece of paper. I know from experience watercolors will dry to be about 20% lighter than what they appear when they're wet. So I'm going to make a point to add more pigment to this mixture, making it more vibrant. I'm even going to add just a little bit of that alizarin crimson to darken it up just a bit. Once I feel like I have the color I want, I'm going to test it out, and that's exactly the color I was going for. So I'm going to rinse my brush real good. I'm going to use my brush to soak up any puddling of the masking fluid, just to thin it out enough so that it dries more quickly. I can even go a step further after it's thinned out and hit it with a blow dryer. Now that the masking fluid is completely dry, I'm going to apply some clean water to the inside of my dog. I'm not afraid of going right over top of the dry masking fluid. I go really slow when I'm up against my edges just to make sure I have control. And I'm not afraid to begin the process with puddles of water. This will ensure that everything stays wet long enough for me to get in my colors. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. Once I have the entire inside shape of the dog filled in with water, I do want to soak up any standing puddles just to make it easier for me to control my paint and where the colors go. If the water is too thick to where I can't even see the texture of the paper through the water, it's going to make it very hard for the paint to stay in the areas I want it to stay. So once I have a nice consistent thin amount of water over the entire dog, I can now dip my brush into the paint color I'd like to include, but I make sure to wipe my brush off on the rim of my palette so that I'm only semi-loading my paint. So I'm going to go right next to that white stripe on the forehead with some of my blues. I'm going to go right around the nose of the dog with my soft blues as well. I'm not afraid to go right down past the mouth and getting a little bit of color on the side of that cheek is what I need as well. I'm going to rinse the blue out of my brush. I'm going to tap my sponge to remove any excess water. And I'm now going to go into that kind of soft pink, gray pink shadow color I made up for the chin. And I'm going to go right underneath the dog's mouth here to get some of those colors in. I'm now going to dry and rinse my brush. And with my dry brush, I can kind of control where these soft pinks are going. And I can use my dry brush by applying pressure over the areas where I might want a little less of that color. And my paintbrush will actually pick up some of that color, making it a little softer, giving me some control over where it goes. I'm now going to add some color in the inside of the ears. I'm wiping my brush off on the rim of my palette to make sure I don't overload it. Now I don't have to worry about getting this color right up to the pencil edge because I know eventually I'll be bringing in some rich blacks into that area. But I do want to at least fill the majority of the inside of the ears with this color. And before this color begins to dry, I'm going to grab a little bit of that brown I mixed up. And I'm going to put a little bit of that brown just on the inside portion of each ear. I'm now going to soak up any puddling of paint. That way it dries predictably. And I'm now going to take a moment to dry this with my blow dryer and then continue with the next layer. Now that everything is dry, I'm going to switch to a medium round brush. This is my number 6. And I'm going to focus on getting some darker fur colors on the left side of my dog. So I'm going to first begin by applying some clean water. And I want to stay into the areas where I see a lot of rich blacks on my animal. I want to make sure I don't have any thick puddles of water, so I'm soaking up any excess water so I have more control. I can now go into that black that I've mixed up, knowing that I'll probably need a couple layers on this black because even within black, there's multiple values. I'm going to continue with some of this black on the opposite side of my masking fluid so I can get that thin, narrow area of black that is on the side of the dog's neck. I also have a little bit of black on the side of the torso. And in order to get a thin layer of black around the edges of the ear, I'm going to hold my brush very vertical, barely applying any pressure with my brush. Having light pressure and holding your brush vertical is going to help you get those thin, narrow lines. I'm going to make sure there's no puddling of black paint. So I'm going to soak up any puddling with dry brush. And then I'm going to give that left side a break. I'm now going to move to the right side. And I'm going to begin by applying clean water just in the area of the rich blacks. I'm not going to worry about the nose at this time or the mouth area. Focusing just primarily on the head and the ear. Keeping my water nice and glossy so it stays wet long enough for me to get everything wet where I want it to be. I'm going to make sure there's no puddles of water. So I want it thin enough to see the texture of the paper before I bring in my blacks. I'm staying out of the nose. In order to get to those areas of the ear that are thin and narrow, I want to make sure I don't have too much moisture in my brush. Otherwise, my brush tends to leave a thicker, wider line. So I like to dry my brush a bit on a sponge, absorb some of that excess paint so it's not puddling as much, and that's going to give me more control. I can then go around the ear, keeping my pressure very light and holding my brush more vertical. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. Taking my time going around that ear. And then while that area is drying, I'm going to continue with some of these blacks on the side of the dog's neck. There's also a little bit of black showing because of the color of the dog. So right through the center here, I want to try and at least give a hint of black, but I'm not filling it in solid because I want it to appear like there is some white fur that is overlapping from top and bottom of the dog in this area. So with a series of just dashed lines or dotted lines at different angles, I'm able to kind of give a hint of that color without actually painting the whole thing in. Now I'm going to get some Payne's Gray, but I'm going to water it down a bit so it's not quite as dark. I'm going to add a little bit of that ultramarine blue to it so it's a little on the blue side. I always test out my colors first. I feel like that's a little dark, so I'm going to lighten it up. Once I'm happy with the color, I'm going to come in close to the area of the mouth. So the upper lip area. And I'm painting wet on dry. And in order to kind of resemble where the whiskers are coming out of the cheek, I can paint little dots with very light pressure. And they're usually relatively in a line. I'm okay with going right over top of this nose to darken it up. I'm going to bring it down past the lips. I'm going to rinse my brush. I just tapped the little dots with a paper towel just to make them a little softer. But with my clean, barely damp brush, I can come into the right side of this area with just a tiniest bit of water to soften the color a bit so it's not so drastic. Same with on the chin area of the bottom lip. Just the tiniest bit of water so I can add a tint down there without making it so obvious. While the dog is continuing to dry, I'm going to take a moment to paint the background. Now I've decided on a very vibrant red for this background. So I'm going to be very thin with my water because I don't want it to dilute my color too much. I just need a little extra help with making sure my color can go down without brush strokes. So I'm just being very, very light with my water application. I'm getting close to the dog without actually touching the edge of the dog. I'm going to make sure to soak up any standing puddles of water because I don't want that. And I'm now going to get that vibrant red that I mixed up. And I go very, very slowly around the edges of my dog. Now, the reason I'm choosing to do this red now is because on the edges of the dog, I do plan on having some very rich, dark black fur textures. And if I do those before my red background, when I paint my red background, I would smear those details. And that's just something that will take practice to know in the planning stage. To make it easier for me to paint some of these edges, I'm going to rotate the painting so that my hand feels more natural getting right up against these edges, so I don't risk going inside the dog. Notice how I'm prioritizing going right up against the edge of my dog first, because I know the rest of my background can be filled in quickly as long as I've protected the edges of my subject. Once I have that background filled in, I just want to make sure there's no puddling of paint, because that would prolong the drying and potentially create blooms. So any low points of my paper, I'm making sure to use a dry brush and very gentle pressure just to soak up any potential puddles. And I'm then going to hit this with the blow dryer. I'm now switching to my number 2 round to begin adding some details to my dog. I'm going to start with my black, and I'm painting wet on dry. And I want to find the darkest areas of my black so I can give some value. So I see a diagonal line of a darker shadow that it runs along the bridge of the nose on this dog. And it kind of curves out and around the cheek area. Now, in order to make the edge of the shadow kind of disappear and fade, I use a barely damp brush, and I just kind of pull some of the edges of that color out to soften it so it's not so harsh. I'm also going to use this black to get some of the dark shadows by the ear. I'm continuing with the dark shadows and the black around the ear area. I'm going to continue with the black on the opposite side of the head. Again, focusing on the darkest areas of black that I see in the shadows. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. I see some dark shadows on the side of the bridge of the nose again. I'm going to darken up some of the hairs right on the side of the neck, giving some texture there so it overlaps the background. I'm going to do the same thing on the opposite side. You can kind of tell how adding the red background is beneficial when you know you're going to come in with real rich blacks, giving texture to some areas of the fur. You don't want those to get all washed out. I'm going to darken up some of the nose. So this is just more of a watered down Payne's gray. I'm trying to keep that circular curve that goes around the nostrils of the dog. And then the dog's nose always come down into a point, central right above the lip. With this being a 3/4 view of the dog's head, I want to make sure that I have one nostril that is more narrow and one that is wider to help with that perspective. Your brain is going to try and tell you to make them both equal, but that's going to throw things off. So just be careful. I'm going to use this watered down Payne's gray to add some texture to the area of the upper lip. I'm doing short little dashed lines that kind of come down at a subtle diagonal to give the impression of a fur texture. I'm going to use some of the brown I mixed up to establish some of the color on the top of the nose. I'm going to use some of my real rich black to color in the jowls that are just peeking out on the side of the mouth. Now the ears have this really cool transition between the soft pink to kind of a brown into a black. In order to get that transition and to make it look smooth, I'm going to apply some clean water with gentle pressure so I don't gouge my previous layers to the inside of the ear. I'm not going to bring the water to cover up the light brown just on the inside. So I'm going to bring it up close without covering up the light browns. So I'm going to tip my paper so you all can see where I applied the water. And I'm just working on one ear at a time. I'm now going to bring in that ear color near the top. And I'm going to give a little bit more shadow to the bottom area. But then as we near the very end of the ear, I want there to be richer blacks. Now I'm going to rinse my brush and remove the water from my brush by dragging it across my sponge. I'm going to grab some of the brown I mixed up, and on the inside portion of the ear, I'm going to add some of that brown. Now the central portion of the ear is lighter in value, so I'm just trying to let that remain clean water. I'm trying not to completely darken up that whole area. So with a clean, damp brush, I can drag it through the lighter areas of the inside ear to pick up any paint or color that might be creeping into those locations. And right now I'm just kind of using my brush to clean up the edges before things begin to dry. I'm now going to do the same thing on the opposite ear. I'm going to bring in clean water, keeping my pressure nice and light so I don't gouge those previous layers. I'm going to grab that ear pink that we mixed up. I'm going to get some real rich Payne's Gray. I'm going to grab some of that brown, put it on the inside corner of the ear. If there are areas where we have those softer pinks in the ear that are getting covered up by our other colors, just rinse your brush and dry it on a sponge or paper towel, and then use your dry brush to kind of push back and control where those colors are creeping into, so you can kind of soften that area. I'm going to let this dry so I can remove the masking fluid. Now that everything is dry, I can remove my masking fluid. I can do that in one of two ways. I can use the pressure of my fingers and just apply pressure and rub the masking fluid off. It will begin to peel up. You just have to apply enough pressure. The other alternative is to use a rubber cement pickup and just use it like an eraser over where you have masking fluid. The benefit of using a rubber cement pickup is the masking fluid will adhere and stick to the edges of the pickup so you have less mess. Now that eyes require lots of layers and drawing in between. So I'm going to begin by just adding a layer of the brown using my small number 2 brush. And I'm going to come back later with a little bit of a bright white gouache just to add the highlights. So I'm not worried about those at the moment. I'm going to use some of the burnt sienna, and it's watered down so it's not too dark. I'm going to add some of this color to the cheeks. This is burnt sienna by itself. I don't have any other colors right now mixed in with it. I'm going to do the same thing on the opposite side. I'm also going to add this color to the brows of the dog. I can just tap with a paper towel if I feel like a little bit lightening up just a smidge. I'm going to rinse that color out of my brush and tap my sponge. I'm going to grab some of that pink shadow color we mixed up, but I want to water it down a bit so it's not too dark. And I want to get some of the shadows that are below that bottom lip area. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. There's lots of little folds and such underneath the chin in this area of the dog. So I'm trying to take my time and pause so I have a chance to kind of see the shapes before painting them. If I move too quickly, I'm guessing. So I need to really slow down. I can continue using this shadow color that is watered down just to add some texture into the white furs of the neck. I'm going to use some of the ultramarine blue that is watered down. And I'm going to add some color to some of the white fur on the head. If I feel the transition between the burnt sienna and white cheeks of the dog are too extreme, I can take a damp brush and with some light scrubbing right along the transition point between those two values, I can soften it a bit so it's not so harsh. I'm going to return to the dog's eyes using the same brown. And I want to paint in the pupils of the dog. Again, I'm not worried about the highlights just yet because I can add those at the end. I'm going to get more of the rich black or Payne's gray. And I'm going to darken up the nostrils. The shape of the nostrils always kind of remind me of quotation marks. So I want to make the height of each nostril in a similar location. However, because of the perspective, I want to make sure the nostril on the right side is more narrow and more of an oval shape. I'm going to apply another layer of this Payne's gray at the very base of the nose. And then before it dries, I'm going to rinse my brush, remove the excess water by dragging my brush across a sponge. And with this damp brush, I'm just going to blend the top edge of this dark black that is on the bottom. I'm also going to take some of this Payne's gray and give a little bit more definition to the mouth. But I'm making a point to not just draw a diagonal line. I'm trying to deliberately create texture so it looks like there is fur overlapping that bottom lip. So I'm not just painting a diagonal line, there's texture to it. And then I'm going to thicken up that black on the bottom lip so it almost looks like a stretched out or elongated triangle. With this Payne's Gray, I can add some little whiskers or hairs on the upper and bottom lip of the dog. I can also use this Payne's Gray to darken up the black fur that is just behind the nose, right on the top. Now, right now, the dog's eyes look a little wacky, but with layers, we're going to be able to make it look more sane. So right now, we haven't established the top eyelid of the dog just yet. So I need to get a really dark section of Payne's Gray on my number 2 round. And I want to establish a thick upper line to indicate that top eyelid. And notice how often I'm pausing to look at the photo to make sure I at least resemble the shape I see. And I'm going to do the same thing on the opposite side. Real dark Payne's Gray is on my brush. I need to establish that thicker upper black eyeliner. There's also some real dark black right on the edge of the iris. Going to darken up some of the pupil. Now I need to narrow the liner on the right side and a little bit on the left, but I know from experience if I let it dry, that's going to be easier tackled. So I'm giving them space to dry, and I'm going to give some texture to the upper brow area. Right now they just look like little circles, but I want to give at least a hint of some fur texture. I'm going to get some of my Payne's Gray. This is a little bit more watered down, but I'm using it to create these little vertical lines or dashes that follow the direction of the hair growth. so I can give some texture to this dog's fur so it doesn't look so flat. If you enjoyed this tutorial, please hit that subscribe button and give me a thumbs up. I have a thin area of black along the side of this dog's cheek that I haven't established yet. So rather than making the cheek whiter, I'm simply adding it on top of that burnt sienna that I established earlier. I'm going to lift and thin out some of the black eyeliner. So I'm going to just use a damp brush, and I'm letting the water basically pick up some of that dark black paint so I can correct the shape on each eye. I can just take a paper towel and dab if I see the paint starting to lift. So a lot of times just a damp brush with some water is all you need to help correct some shapes. I'm going to use some of that burnt sienna to add just a little bit more of a brighter color to the eyes. Now that area is wet. I can't really work in the eyes any further until it dries. So I'm going to get some of that brown color that I mixed up, and I'm going to add some texture to the fur on the side of the dog's head. It's a little bit more of a diagonal. It's definitely a darker color on the bottom and left edge. So I'm being aware of that. I'm going to do the same thing on the right side. Just layering some of that brown that was mixed up. I'm going to get some of that watered down Payne's Gray and darken up just a couple of the shadows that are in the area of the neck. I'm going to do that above and below the area of the collar. I'm going to water down this Payne's Gray further. And I'm going to layer a glaze of this Payne's Gray selectively on just a couple areas of the shadows that are on the bottom lip area. I'm going to grab more of this Payne's Gray and add more texture to the fur of the head on the left side. The fur is going to be going down at a diagonal angle below the eye. And just adding more layers of black to give more contrast between the lips. I feel like the pupil on the left eye is a little wider than the pupil on the right, so I'm just going to use that water on the brush trick to make that pupil a little more narrow. I can also lighten some of the black that is across the ridge of that lower eyelid just to give a little bit more depth. I feel like the eyes are such an important part of the animal that they are worth taking the extra time and patience to do right. I'm now going to use a little bit of this opaque white on my palette. I'm making sure my brush is completely clean before I go in here and grab some of it. And I'm going to tint the first part of it with some of my ultramarine blue. And I don't want to have my brush overloaded with it. I want just enough to give a little bit of blue to some of the reflections on the eye. I can also use this to add just a little bit of detail to the nose. If I feel like some of the highlights on the nose got lost. I'm also going to use this color to indicate some of the little furs that are on the upper lip. I can do the same thing on the bottom lip if I feel like it's necessary. I'm now going to rinse all of that color out of my brush, and I'm just going to grab some plain white. I'm not going to add any other color to it, making sure it's not overloaded. And I'm going to add some bright white to some areas of the eyes to look like a reflection. If I overload my brush, my marks are going to be much larger than I intend, so I have to be very careful and watch how much paint is on my brush. I can add some white just as a highlight to part of the nose. I can use some of this white on the bottom folds of the neck if I feel like things got a little muddled down there and I just need a little extra help. I can just tap my brush and create just a few thin lines. Just adding some texture to the fur on the neck. I'm going to add a little bit of white to some burnt sienna. Because I just want to get a little bit more of this vibrant brown in a couple areas. So I'm just kind of giving it some hair texture so it looks more natural. But this is my favorite stage of a pet portrait where I get to really push the details. And try to do the pet justice. There's just a little bit of that golden brown on the inside of the ear that I want to capture. Right now, the color stands out a lot. However, with just a wet brush, I can kind of dampen the edges and make that less obvious. So my brush is now clean with barely any water on it. And I can just take a damp brush and kind of blend the outer edges if they need it. But otherwise, I feel like this pet portrait is done. I'm happy with how it turned out, and I hope you learned a lot. Have a fantastic holiday.